November 17, 1943. Camp McCain, Mississippi. ***. The late autumn sun hung low over the pine forests of northern Mississippi, casting long shadows across the newly erected barbed wire fences. Inside the wooden barracks of prisoner of war Camp McCain, Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann sat rigid on the edge of his bunk, his hands trembling despite his best efforts to still them. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with the earthy scent of Mississippi clay. Through the thin walls, he could hear the unfamiliar cadence of American voices, the strange musical quality of their southern drawls punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed entirely out of place in a prison camp. For 3 days since his arrival, Klaus had barely eaten, barely slept. He had been trained to expect execution, torture, or at minimum the brutal conditions he had witnessed in the eastern camps. Instead, there was hot water for washing, clean blankets, and most disturbing of all, those persistent American smiles. Nothing in his 7 years of National Socialist education had prepared him for this particular form of warfare. The journey that brought Klaus Hartmann to this Mississippi pine forest had begun 6 months earlier in the scorching deserts of North Africa. He had been part of the Afrika Korps, that supposedly invincible force that had swept across Libya and threatened to seize the Suez Canal. The propaganda had been magnificent, glorious even. Newsreels showed German soldiers as bronzed heroes, modern crusaders bringing civilization to a backward continent. General Oberst Erwin Rommel was portrayed as a military genius, the desert fox whose tactical brilliance would deliver North Africa to the Reich. Klaus had believed every word. He had written letters home describing the inevitable victory, the weakness of the British forces, the certainty that by Christmas they would be bathing in the Mediterranean as conquerors. But propaganda, he discovered, provided no defense against superior logistics. The Allies had bombed the supply convoys relentlessly. Water became scarce, then ammunition, then fuel. By May 1943, when the final surrender came at Tunisia, Klaus had been subsisting on half-rations for weeks, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost nearly 30 pounds. The defeat should have been his lowest moment, but in truth, he felt only relief that the dying was finally over. What Klaus could not have known, squatting in that surrender cage in Tunisia, was that he was about to become part of the largest prisoner transfer operation in American history. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States would intern approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners of war on American soil. The numbers were staggering, unprecedented. Entire camps had to be constructed across the continental United States, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Iowa, from the industrial centers of Pennsylvania to the cotton fields of the Deep South. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided the framework, but nothing in international law could have prepared American military planners for the logistical complexity of housing, feeding, and managing hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers thousands of miles from any battlefield. The decision to transport prisoners across the Atlantic rather than maintain them in the European or North African theaters was driven by cold military calculation. Europe needed every available ship, every rail car, every calorie of food for the liberation effort. America, by contrast, had space, resources, and a domestic infrastructure untouched by bombardment. But beneath the logistics lay a more subtle calculation. These prisoners would see America. They would experience it. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would return to Germany with something more valuable than military intelligence. They would return with doubt. The transatlantic crossing had been Klaus's first lesson in American abundance. The Liberty ship that carried him and 900 other prisoners westward was crowded, uncomfortable, and often violently tossed by November storms. But there were meals. Regular meals. Twice daily the prisoners received portions that, while not lavish, exceeded what many of them had eaten during the final months in Africa. There was coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute they had endured. There were cigarettes distributed by Red Cross workers. Klaus remembered standing on the deck one evening, smoking an American Lucky Strike, watching the sun set over an ocean that seemed impossibly vast, and feeling a strange cognitive dissonance. The propaganda ministry had spent years explaining how America was a decadent, weakened nation, corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro degeneracy, barely capable of industrial production, certainly incapable of projecting military power. Yet here was a ship, one of hundreds, carrying prisoners across a submarine-infested ocean, fed and clothed and transported with an efficiency that the vaunted German war machine could no longer manage for its own troops. The thought was dangerous, heretical even. Klaus pushed it away and drew again on his cigarette, letting the American tobacco calm nerves that had been jangled since Tunisia. Camp McCain had been constructed with remarkable speed. Before 1942, the site had been nothing but pine forest and subsistence farms. By the time Klaus arrived, it housed over 5,000 German prisoners in a sprawling complex of barracks, mess halls, recreation facilities, and administrative buildings. The camp followed the standardized design developed by the War Department, a rectangular layout surrounded by double fences, guard towers at regular intervals, searchlights that swept the grounds after dark. But for all its martial architecture, McCain had a strange quality that Klaus struggled to define. It was not cruel. The guards carried weapons but rarely displayed them aggressively. The commandant, a colonel whose name Klaus would later learn was James Alton, ran the facility with bureaucratic precision but without evident sadism. There were rules, many rules, but they were posted in German, explained clearly, enforced consistently. Prisoners who obeyed received no harassment. Those who broke regulations faced defined punishments, usually loss of privileges rather than physical abuse. It was, Klaus slowly realized, more orderly than many Wehrmacht units he had served in. This realization troubled him more than brutality would have. The first week passed in a haze of adjustment. Klaus and his fellow prisoners were processed, photographed, fingerprinted, assigned barracks and work details. They received medical examinations more thorough than any Klaus had experienced in the German military. A dentist, an actual dentist, examined their teeth and offered treatment for cavities and infections. New prisoners who arrived with dysentery or malaria from the African campaign were immediately hospitalized in the camp infirmary where American medics treated them with the same supplies and techniques used for their own soldiers. Klaus witnessed a young private from Hamburg, barely 19 years old, receive a blood transfusion that almost certainly saved his life. The American blood that flowed into German veins seemed to carry its own silent message. This was not the behavior of the mongrel, degraded enemy force they had been taught to expect. This was something far more dangerous. This was competence tempered with principle. But if the material conditions surprised the prisoners, it was the psychological warfare that truly unsettled them. Because that was what Klaus believed it must be, at first. Psychological warfare. A sophisticated American technique to break down their resistance, to extract information, to turn them into collaborators. Why else would the guards attempt conversation? Why would they show photographs of their families, their farms, their hometowns? Why would they share their own rations, passing cookies or candy through the fence to prisoners working on maintenance details? Klaus had been warned about such tactics. The briefings before deployment had been explicit. American intelligence was subtle, devious. They would befriend you, gain your trust, and then exploit that trust to gather strategic information. He must remain vigilant. He must maintain the defensive posture of a National Socialist soldier, proud in captivity, revealing nothing, resisting all attempts at corruption. But as the days accumulated into weeks, Klaus's certainty began to erode. The Americans did not interrogate him. They did not ask about troop movements or weapon systems or command structures. They asked instead about the weather in Bavaria. They asked if he had family. They asked if he played any sports. And sometimes they asked if he knew how to play cards. The card games began almost accidentally, or so it seemed. Sergeant Roy Mitchell from Tupelo, Mississippi, had drawn guard duty in Compound C where Klaus's barracks was located. Mitchell was 38 years old, too old for combat infantry but perfectly suited for stateside guard work. He had been a mechanic before the war, a quiet man with calloused hands and a weathered face that suggested a lifetime of outdoor work. On a cool evening in late November, Mitchell sat on a stool outside the guard post, shuffling a worn deck of bicycle playing cards with the unconscious skill of long practice. Several prisoners, Klaus among them, had gathered near the fence, drawn by boredom and curiosity. Mitchell looked up, noticed their attention, and without preamble began dealing out a hand of solitaire on a makeshift table fashioned from ammunition crates. He worked slowly, deliberately, arranging the cards with focused precision. Klaus watched, fascinated despite himself. Card games had been common enough in the Wehrmacht, but they had been furtive affairs, officially discouraged as frivolous distractions from military discipline. Here was an American soldier, on duty, playing cards openly and without shame. The contradiction was yet another small fissure in Klaus's understanding of how military forces operated. Mitchell finished his game of solitaire, gathered the cards, and then did something unprecedented. He looked directly at Klaus and spoke in slow, carefully enunciated English. "You boys know how to play rummy?" The question hung in the air. Klaus understood enough English from his gymnasium education to grasp the meaning, but responding felt dangerous, like crossing an invisible threshold. Around him, the other prisoners shifted nervously. Then from behind Klaus, a voice answered in heavily accented English. "Ja, yes, we know cards." Klaus turned to see Friedrich Becker, a former corporal from the Rhineland who had worked in a hotel before the war and spoke passable English. Mitchell grinned, stood, and approached the fence. He extended the deck of cards through the wire. "Well, come on then. Can't play from over here. Guard!" He called to another soldier visible in the distant tower. "I'm bringing 3 prisoners to the post for recreation. Authorized by Colonel Alton's standing order." The tower guard waved acknowledgment. Mitchell unlocked a small service gate in the fence. You, and you," he pointed at Klaus, Friedrich, and a third prisoner named Hans. "Come on. Let's see if Germans know anything about American rummy." What followed was perhaps the strangest hour of Klaus Hartmann's military service. He sat at an improvised table outside the guard post, under the watchful but not hostile eyes of Sergeant Mitchell, playing cards with enemy soldiers as if they were neighbors at a village gasthaus. Mitchell explained the rules of rummy in a mixture of English, gestures, and the few German words he had picked up. "Grupp, how you say, make the groups, ja? 3 same, or straight like steps." Friedrich translated more completely, and soon the game was underway. Mitchell dealt with practiced ease, humming tunelessly under his breath. When Klaus laid down his first meld, 3 queens, Mitchell nodded approval. "Good hand, Jerry. Real good hand." The use of the casual nickname, Jerry, felt strange but not insulting. It was spoken without venom, almost with affection, the way one might address a sporting opponent. As they played, Mitchell talked, a steady stream of observations about the weather, about how Mississippi compared to Germany, about his wife who worked in a canning factory back in Tupelo. He asked if Klaus had a wife. Klaus shook his head. Mitchell nodded sympathetically. "War's hard on finding a girl, I reckon. Hard on keeping one too, all this time apart." It was such a simple, human observation. It assumed Klaus was a person with normal desires and disappointments, not a representative of an evil ideology to be destroyed. The card games became a regular feature of camp life at McCain, then at hundreds of other camps across America. What began as Sergeant Mitchell's informal initiative was soon recognized by camp administrators as an effective tool for managing morale and reducing tensions. The War Department issued guidelines encouraging recreational activities that promoted positive interaction between guards and prisoners while maintaining security protocols. Card games were ideal. They required no specialized equipment, involved no physical contact that might pose security risks, and created structured social situations that normalized relations between captors and captives. By 1944, camp libraries stocked multiple decks of cards. Recreation halls hosted organized tournaments. Guards taught prisoners poker, hearts, bridge, gin rummy. Prisoners taught guards skat, doppelkopf, schafkopf. The exchange of card games became an exchange of cultures, a small bridge across the chasm of war. For Klaus and thousands like him, these games represented something more profound than simple entertainment. They represented the first sustained friendly interaction with Americans, the first opportunity to see their captors as individuals rather than propaganda caricatures. Through the card games, Klaus began to learn about America in ways no intelligence briefing could have conveyed. He learned that Sergeant Mitchell's father had been a sharecropper, working land he did not own, struggling with poverty that would not have been unfamiliar in rural Bavaria. Yet Mitchell bore no resentment about his origins. He spoke matter-of-factly about hardship, then about his own trajectory, how he had saved money, learned a trade, bought his own garage, married, built a modest but secure life. This was the American doctrine they had been taught to despise, the notion that a man of humble birth could rise through his own effort. Propaganda had insisted this was a lie, that American capitalism created only exploitation and inequality. But here was Mitchell, living proof of mobility, neither wealthy nor desperate, simply comfortable and, more importantly, content. When Klaus asked through Friedrich's translation whether Mitchell resented the rich, the sergeant looked genuinely puzzled. Resent them? Why would I? Man works hard, gets lucky, good for him. It's not like there's only so much to go around. America's a big place. Room enough for folks to make their way. The answer was so foreign to Klaus's European understanding of class and social structure that he struggled to process it. Where was the resentment, the class warfare, the revolutionary potential that Marxist and National Socialist analyses both insisted must exist in capitalist societies? The abundance became impossible to ignore. Camp McCain, despite being a prisoner facility, served food that exceeded what German civilians had eaten even before the war. Breakfast typically included oatmeal or cornmeal mush, eggs several times a week, toast with real butter, coffee, and milk. Lunch and dinner rotated through menus featuring meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and occasional desserts. The portions met Geneva Convention requirements, but more significantly, they arrived reliably, day after day, without interruption. Klaus remembered the final months in Africa where their supply situation had deteriorated so badly that men were grinding down captured British hardtack and mixing it with olive oil to create something vaguely edible. He remembered the constant gnawing hunger, the way thoughts of food dominated every idle moment. At McCain, he gained back the weight he had lost, then gained more. His uniform, replaced with prisoner clothing marked with PW on the back, actually fit properly for the first time since 1941. And it was not just the prisoners who ate well. He observed the guards, common soldiers from unremarkable backgrounds, eating the same food, sometimes sharing from the same kitchens. Where was the privation? Where was the desperation of a nation supposedly bankrupted by its decadent economic system and mongrel population? The work details provided further revelation. Geneva Convention regulations required that prisoner labor be non-military in nature and reasonably compensated. Across the United States, German POWs were deployed in agriculture, forestry, and light manufacturing to address the severe labor shortage created by wartime mobilization. Klaus was assigned to a forestry detail, cutting timber in the Mississippi pine forests under the supervision of both military guards and civilian contractors. The work was hard but not brutal. They received appropriate tools, safety instruction, and regular rest breaks. More importantly, they were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, money that could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other small luxuries. 80 cents was a pittance by American standards, but it was payment nonetheless. Klaus had never been paid for his military service beyond basic necessities. The German military system assumed ideological commitment, not economic incentive. Yet here were the Americans, paying enemy prisoners for their labor, acknowledging through the transaction that work deserved compensation. The gesture embedded a principle, a very dangerous principle. It suggested that the individual had value independent of his service to the state. It suggested that a man's labor belonged to him, not to some collective abstraction. These were the poisonous seeds of liberal democracy, and Klaus could feel them taking root despite his best efforts to maintain ideological immunity. As winter gave way to spring in 1944, Klaus noticed changes in himself and in his fellow prisoners. The rigid military posture that they had maintained in the first weeks began to relax. Men smiled more, laughed more. The constant tension that had characterized their final months of combat service dissipated. They were still prisoners, still theoretically the enemy, but they were also well-fed, adequately sheltered, and treated with baseline human dignity. This combination produced a strange psychological effect. The war continued across the ocean, but it felt increasingly distant, increasingly abstract. Radio broadcasts in the camp provided war news, carefully monitored by American authorities, and Klaus listened to reports of Allied advances in Italy, the massive Soviet offensives pushing west, the relentless bombing of German cities. Each piece of news should have filled him with patriotic anger, with determination to resist. Instead, he felt mostly numb, detached, as if watching events unfold in some other reality. He was here in Mississippi, playing cards with Sergeant Mitchell, eating 3 meals daily, sleeping without fear of artillery or aerial bombardment. The contrast made sustained hatred difficult to maintain. The symbolism of the card games deepened as Klaus began to understand them as something more than simple recreation. Cards represented chance and skill in combination, the American doctrine that life involved both luck and effort. The Germans played skat, a game of rigid structure, complex rules, and hierarchical positioning. The Americans preferred poker, a game of calculated risk, psychological reading, and individual decision-making. When Mitchell taught Klaus Texas Hold'em, he explained the basic philosophy. See, it ain't just about the cards you're dealt. That's luck, can't control that. It's about what you do with them. When to hold, when to fold, when to push your advantage. That's the skill part. That's what makes the game interesting. Klaus recognized the metaphor immediately. This was American individualism distilled into a card game. You were dealt a hand by fate, but your choices determined the outcome. No central planner told you how to play. No ideology dictated the correct strategy. You observed, you calculated, you decided, and you lived with the consequences. It was both terrifying and exhilarating to Klaus, raised in a system where decisions were made by the Führer, by the state, by the party, and individual judgment was subordinated to collective will. The war in Europe reached its climax as Klaus played cards in Mississippi. D-Day came in June 1944, and the prisoners listened to heavily censored but still momentous reports of the Allied landings in Normandy. Some reacted with defiant assertions that the invasion would be thrown back into the sea. Others maintained studied silence. Klaus found himself hoping quietly that it would end soon, that Germany would surrender before more cities were destroyed, more lives wasted. This thought would have been treason 6 months earlier. Now it felt like simple realism. The Americans clearly had inexhaustible resources. They fed their prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. Their equipment, their logistics, their industrial capacity dwarfed anything the Reich could muster. The propaganda that had sustained him through years of service had been exposed as hollow fantasy by the simple reality of American abundance. You could not maintain belief in enemy weakness when that enemy provided you with 3 meals daily, medical care, and recreational facilities while simultaneously fighting wars on multiple continents. The cognitive dissonance was insurmountable. As summer 1944 wore on, camp administrators introduced a new program that would profoundly affect Klaus and thousands of other prisoners. The re-education program, officially called the Intellectual Diversion Program to avoid the appearance of violating Geneva Convention prohibitions on political indoctrination, aimed to introduce prisoners to democratic principles and Western cultural values. The program was voluntary, carefully designed to inform rather than coerce, and remarkably sophisticated in its approach. Camp libraries expanded to include German-language books, newspapers, and magazines carefully selected to present alternatives to National Socialist ideology without resorting to crude propaganda. Discussion groups formed, led by German anti-Nazi émigrés who had fled to America before the war. Films were shown, not just entertainment but documentaries about American history, the Constitutional Convention, the Bill of Rights, the Civil War, and the abolition of slavery. Klaus attended initially out of boredom, but found himself genuinely engaged. One particular film struck him deeply. It documented the Tennessee Valley Authority, Roosevelt's massive public works project that brought electricity to impoverished rural regions. The film showed transformation, communities lifted from subsistence to modest prosperity through democratic government action. What struck Klaus was not just the material improvement but the fact that this was presented as normal, as what government should do, serve the people rather than the people serving the state. The intellectual assault on National Socialist ideology was complemented by simple human connection. Sergeant Mitchell continued his card games, now joined by other guards who had seen the positive effect on camp morale. But Mitchell also brought something more valuable than entertainment. He brought newspapers, regular copies of the Commercial Appeal from Memphis and the Tupelo Daily Journal. He would sit with Klaus and Friedrich, helping them work through articles in English, explaining idioms and cultural references. The newspapers provided an unfiltered window into American civilian life that was far more persuasive than any official program. Klaus read about war bond drives, about scrap metal collection, about victory gardens and rationing. He read about mothers who had lost sons in combat, about the grief but also the pride, the sense that the sacrifice served a moral purpose. He read letters to the editor debating government policy, civilians openly disagreeing with their leaders without fear of midnight arrests. He read crime reports, labor disputes, political scandals, all reported freely in papers that faced no censorship. The transparency was shocking. The German press had been uniformly positive, always presenting the state and its leaders in heroic terms, always suppressing doubt or criticism. American papers apparently operated under different principles, and Klaus slowly grasped that this was not a weakness but a strength, that a society secure in its principles could tolerate dissent without collapse. The card games evolved into genuine friendships, as improbable as that seemed. Klaus began to anticipate the evenings when Mitchell would appear at the compound fence, deck of cards in hand. They would play rummy or poker, sometimes joined by other prisoners and guards, sometimes just the two of them. Mitchell taught Klaus the fine points of bluffing in poker, how to read facial expressions and betting patterns. Klaus taught Mitchell the complexities of scat, though the Americans struggled with the game's Byzantine scoring system. They talked, haltingly at first as Klaus's English improved, then more fluently. Mitchell spoke about his hopes for after the war, about expanding his garage, maybe buying some land, raising cattle as a sideline. Klaus spoke about Bavaria, about the mountains and forests, about his father's carpentry shop, about how beautiful Munich had been before the bombs. Neither spoke of ideology. Neither needed to. The friendship existed in a space beyond politics, a simple human connection between men who, under different circumstances, would never have met, never have had reason to see each other as anything other than enemies. Yet here they were, sharing cigarettes, laughing at each other's jokes, finding common ground in the universal experiences of hardship, hope, and the desire for simple peace. By autumn 1944, as Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west, Klaus had undergone a transformation he could not have imagined a year earlier. He still considered himself German, still felt pride in his culture and heritage, but the National Socialist ideology that had once seemed so compelling, so righteous, now appeared hollow and absurd. He had seen what it produced: war, destruction, defeat, and in the carefully curated documentary films shown in the camp, the first disturbing hints of something far worse, whispers and grainy photographs suggesting atrocities in the East that Klaus desperately wanted to dismiss as Allied propaganda but feared might be true. In contrast, he had seen what American democracy produced: abundance, individual liberty, the capacity to wage total war while maintaining core principles of human dignity. The comparison was devastating. Klaus began to understand that Germany had not lost merely because of tactical or strategic failures, but because of fundamental ideological bankruptcy. You could not build a lasting society on hatred, on racial hierarchy, on the glorification of violence. The American model, for all its flaws and contradictions which Klaus certainly observed, offered something more durable. It offered the proposition that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, would generally choose productive cooperation over destructive conflict. The Christmas of 1944 at Camp McCain became a symbol of this transformation. American authorities, following Geneva Convention requirements but going significantly beyond them, organized Christmas celebrations that stunned the prisoners. Trees were decorated in the recreation halls. Care packages from the Red Cross distributed candy, cookies, cigarettes, and small gifts. Most incredibly, guards and prisoners organized a joint Christmas Eve gathering. Sergeant Mitchell and several other guards brought their families to the camp, wives and children who had been curious about these German prisoners their husbands and fathers spoke about. The prisoners performed Christmas carols in German, traditional songs that most had sung since childhood. Still Nacht, O Tannenbaum, es ist ein Ros entsprungen. The American families listened respectfully, then responded with their own carols in English. The moment was surreal, almost unbearable in its strange beauty. Here were people who had been locked in existential combat, whose nations were still destroying each other across the ocean, sharing the holiest night of the Christian calendar in genuine community. Klaus stood in that decorated hall, singing songs his mother had taught him, looking at the American children who gazed at the prisoners with curiosity rather than fear, and felt something break inside him, some last wall of resistance. He wept, openly and without shame, and was not alone. All around him, hardened soldiers who had survived the Africa Corps, men who had endured combat and captivity, stood with tears streaming down their faces, overcome by the simple recognition of shared humanity. The new year brought news of the final German collapse. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, failed. Soviet armies pushed into Germany itself. American and British forces crossed the Rhine. As spring 1945 arrived, it became clear that the war was ending. Klaus listened to the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the dying would stop, grief for the destruction of his homeland, and fear about what would come next. But that fear was tempered by his experience at McCain. If this was how Americans treated enemy prisoners during wartime, perhaps occupied Germany would not be the nightmare that Goebbels had promised. Perhaps there would be a future after the collapse, a chance to rebuild on different principles. The card games continued through those final months. Mitchell never spoke of victory or defeat, never gloated or condemned. He simply dealt the cards, played his hands, and treated Klaus with the same respect he had shown from the beginning. That consistency, that refusal to alter his behavior based on military developments, taught Klaus more about American character than any formal education program could have achieved. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the camp gathered for a formal announcement. Colonel Alton addressed the prisoners directly, speaking through a translator. He acknowledged the end of hostilities, the finality of German defeat. But his tone was not triumphant. It was sober, almost sad, acknowledging the terrible cost the war had exacted from all nations. He spoke about the future, about the process of repatriation that would eventually return prisoners to Germany, about the hope that they would carry with them some understanding of American principles and would help build a new, democratic Germany. Klaus listened and believed it was possible. Not because of any official program or propaganda, but because of Sergeant Mitchell and those card games. Because he had been shown through action rather than words that the American system, whatever its flaws, was built on a foundation of respect for individual human worth. That foundation made everything else possible. The prosperity, the freedom, the resilience. Germany had built on hatred and had reaped ruins. America had built on imperfect but genuine idealism and had created a society wealthy enough to feed its enemies, confident enough to treat them as potential friends. The repatriation process extended over many months. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners across a war-damaged Atlantic to a Germany devastated and occupied required time. Klaus remained at Camp McCain through the summer of 1945 and into the autumn. During those months, the character of the camp changed subtly. With the war over, security relaxed further. Prisoners on work details encountered more civilians, farmers, and businessmen who hired POW labor through official channels. Klaus worked on several farms, helping with harvest, and was struck again by the abundance. American farms were mechanized to a degree German agriculture had never achieved. Tractors, combines, electric pumps for irrigation, trucks for transport. The farmers complained about labor shortages and government regulations, but to Klaus they lived like landlords, their complaints those of prosperous men annoyed by inconvenience rather than desperate men facing ruin. He watched them, learned from them, and began to imagine a future where perhaps he might emigrate, might seek a new start in this vast, wealthy, strange nation that had defeated him and then treated him better than his own government ever had. Sergeant Mitchell received orders in October 1945 for discharge. His service was ending, and he would return to Tupelo, to his wife and his garage and the civilian life he had left behind. On his final evening at McCain, he sought out Klaus for one last card game. They sat at their usual spot, the improvised table outside the guard post, and played gin rummy as the sun set over the pine forest. Neither spoke much. The friendship had moved beyond words, existed now in comfortable silence and familiar ritual. Mitchell won the final hand, gathered the cards, and then did something unexpected. He split the deck, shuffled each half, and then pushed one half across the table to Klaus. "Keep these, Jerry. Something to remember." Klaus took the worn cards, 26 random cards from a bicycle deck that had seen hundreds of games. They were worthless, just paper and ink. They were priceless, a token of connection across the chasm of war. Mitchell stood, extended his hand. Klaus shook it, felt the calloused grip of a working man, a man not so different from himself. "You're all right, Klaus," Mitchell said, using his actual name for perhaps the first time. "You get back to Germany, you help them folks figure out how to live peaceful. We're done killing each other." Klaus nodded, unable to speak. Mitchell picked up his remaining cards, gave a casual salute, and walked away into the gathering dusk. Klaus never saw him again. Klaus Hartmann was finally repatriated to Germany in March 1946. The transport ship that carried him and hundreds of other prisoners across the Atlantic reversed the journey he had made 2.5 years earlier. But everything had changed. He had changed. The man who arrived at Camp McCain terrified and indoctrinated was gone. In his place was someone harder to define, someone caught between worlds, no longer fully German in his understanding of how society should function, not yet American but carrying American ideas like seeds planted in foreign soil. The Germany he returned to shocked him, even though he had been prepared by newsreels and descriptions. The cities were rubble. Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Cologne, vast urban landscapes reduced to broken stone and exposed rebar. Millions displaced, homeless, wandering. The occupation authorities, American, British, French, and Soviet, dividing the country into zones. And emerging slowly, terrible revelations about the camps, about the systematic murder, about the full extent of the regime's crimes. Klaus had suspected, had feared, but the documented reality was worse than his darkest imaginings. The ideology he had once embraced had produced not just military defeat but moral catastrophe. In the chaos of occupied Germany, Klaus struggled to find his place. He returned to Bavaria, to Munich, but his family's home was gone, destroyed in the bombing. His father had died in a raid in 1944. His mother and sister had survived but were living in a displaced persons camp. He found work clearing rubble, backbreaking labor for poor pay, but it was work, a start. Germany was being rebuilt, but the question was what kind of Germany would emerge from the ruins. The Western Allies pushed for democracy, for market economics, for integration into a broader European community. The Soviets in the East imposed communism. Klaus watched these competing visions struggle for dominance and knew which he supported. Not because of political theory or economic doctrine, but because of those card games in Mississippi. Because he had seen American democracy function at the most basic level, in the simple dignity with which Sergeant Mitchell had treated him. If Germany could build a society on those principles, treating individuals as worthy of respect, creating systems that serve people rather than demanding people serve the system, then perhaps the catastrophe of National Socialism could give way to something better. Klaus's experience was not unique. Across Germany, returning prisoners brought back stories of their treatment in America. These stories spread, creating a reservoir of positive sentiment toward the United States that would prove invaluable during the Cold War years. The men who had been fed, clothed, treated fairly, and shown the possibilities of democratic society became advocates for Western integration. They became voices against Soviet-style communism, which looked far too similar to the totalitarianism they had just escaped. When the Marshall Plan brought American aid to rebuild German infrastructure, when the Berlin airlift demonstrated American commitment to German freedom, when the Federal Republic was established with a constitution heavily influenced by American principles, returning prisoners of war understood in their bones what was at stake. They had seen both systems. They had lived the difference. The choice was obvious. The Berlin Wall would eventually stand as the starkest symbol of that choice, a physical barrier dividing not just a city but two incompatible visions of human society. On the Western side, imperfect but genuine freedom, prosperity built on market economics and individual liberty. On the Eastern side, repression, surveillance, and the shabby equality of shared poverty. Klaus lived long enough to see the wall fall in 1989, lived long enough to see the final vindication of the principles he had learned through card games in a Mississippi prison camp 45 years earlier. He was an old man by then, a successful carpenter who had rebuilt his father's business, who had raised children in a democratic Germany that he could never have imagined as a young soldier in the Afrika Korps. When he watched the television footage of Germans dancing on the wall, sledgehammers attacking the concrete, he thought of Sergeant Mitchell. He wondered if the American was still alive, still in Tupelo, perhaps watching the same footage. He hoped Mitchell understood the role he and thousands like him had played in this moment. They had waged a different kind of warfare, a warfare of example rather than violence, of human connection rather than ideology. And they had won. The cards Klaus had kept from that final game with Mitchell remained in his possession until his death. 26 random cards, their backs worn smooth by handling, kept in a small wooden box he had made himself. His children found them after his funeral in 1994, puzzled by why their father had preserved such ordinary objects with such evident care. His daughter discovered a letter tucked beneath the cards, written in her father's careful handwriting, explaining their significance. The letter told the story of Camp McCain, of the terror and the transformation, of the sergeant who had taught him cards and in doing so had taught him that enemies could become friends, that ideology need not be permanent, that individuals possess the capacity to choose different paths. The letter ended with an instruction. The cards should be donated to a museum, perhaps a military museum or a historical society, as a small testament to an often forgotten dimension of the Second World War. Not the grand battles or famous generals, but the quiet work of ordinary soldiers who maintained their humanity even in the midst of industrial slaughter, who saw in their captives not abstract enemies but fellow human beings worthy of respect. The cards eventually found their way to the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum at Camp Shelby, where they remain today in a modest display case, accompanied by Klaus's letter and a photograph of Sergeant Roy Mitchell in his uniform, a faint smile on his weathered face. There is a poetry in objects that transcend their physical nature to embody larger truths. Those cards, mass-produced and unremarkable, became sacred relics through the meaning invested in them by human experience. They spoke of abundance, yes, the American capacity to produce so much that even recreation could be taken for granted, even prisoners could be supplied with non-essential items for entertainment. But more profoundly, they spoke of a philosophical commitment to the value of individual human beings. The decision to engage prisoners in card games rather than simply warehousing them reflected a belief that people, even enemy people, deserved dignity, stimulation, and the opportunity for normal social interaction. That belief was not naive or sentimental. It was rooted in the democratic principle that legitimate authority derived from respect for human worth, not from force alone. The Americans who ran the POW camps understood intuitively what their government understood strategically, that the peace after the war would be shaped by the experiences of those who fought it. Treating prisoners well was not weakness but wisdom, not softness but sophisticated statecraft. The legacy of the POW experience extended far beyond individual prisoners like Klaus Hartmann. It influenced the entire trajectory of post-war German development. The Federal Republic that emerged in 1949 was built on democratic foundations that were not entirely imposed from outside but had been partially internalized by Germans who had seen democracy function in America. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, the Wirtschaftswunder that transformed West Germany into an industrial powerhouse, was built on American-style market economics implemented by Germans who had witnessed American prosperity firsthand. The integration of Germany into NATO and the broader Western alliance was facilitated by positive sentiments among Germans who had been treated well as prisoners and who trusted American intentions. None of this was predetermined or automatic. It required work, negotiation, and the overcoming of deep hatreds. But the foundation had been laid in those camps, in those card games, in those thousands of small interactions where American guards and German prisoners discovered their common humanity. In the long accounting of World War II, the prisoner of war camps on American soil occupy a footnote, a minor administrative detail in a conflict of unprecedented scale and horror. The great battles receive the attention, the strategic decisions, the technological innovations, the crimes, and the heroism. But history is shaped as much by the mundane as by the dramatic, by the accumulated weight of ordinary actions as much as by singular extraordinary events. Every prisoner who returned to Germany with memories of decent treatment, every former soldier who told his children that Americans were not monsters but men, every voice that argued for Western integration rather than neutrality or Eastern alignment, these represented returns on investment in human dignity. The cost was minimal, Some extra food, some recreational supplies, the assignment of guards who might have served elsewhere. The return was a Germany that became America's strongest European ally, a bulwark against Soviet expansion, eventually a unified democratic nation of 80 million people firmly anchored in the Western community of nations. Sergeant Roy Mitchell returned to Tupelo, reopened his garage, and lived a quiet life. He did not speak much about his war service. When asked, he would say he had been stationed stateside, nothing heroic, just guard duty at a prison camp. He never mentioned the card games, never spoke of the Germans he had befriended. It was not modesty so much as a belief that he had simply done his job, nothing special, nothing worth discussing. But history is made by people who do their jobs with integrity, who maintain their principles even when no one is watching, who choose humanity over hatred when hatred would be easier. Mitchell played cards with enemy prisoners because it seemed like the right thing to do, because men needed recreation and company, because treating people decently was simply how one behaved. That simple choice, multiplied by thousands of guards at hundreds of camps, helped transform a nation and secure a peace. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories. The Berlin airlift saved a city. But the card games rebuilt something harder to quantify and more essential, a belief that the Western model of democracy and freedom represented not just power but justice, not just victory but virtue. In the end, what terrified Klaus Hartmann in those first days at Camp McCain was not cruelty but kindness. Cruelty he had been prepared for, had been trained to resist, had been taught to expect. Kindness was disarming, devastating to his ideological certainty. You cannot maintain hatred for people who feed you, care for you when you are sick, treat you as human despite having every reason to dehumanize you. The card games were the perfect vehicle for this transformation because they required nothing but presence, attention, and a willingness to engage. They created a space where ideology could be set aside, where German and American could meet simply as men who liked cards, and in that space the propaganda dissolved, the hatred evaporated, and what remained was possibility. The possibility that enemies could become friends. The possibility that nations could move beyond war. The possibility that a young German soldier who had believed in National Socialism with the fervor of youth could learn different truths and carry them home to a shattered country desperately in need of new foundations. Those possibilities, nurtured in a Mississippi prison camp over games of rummy and poker, helped shape the second half of the 20th century. And they began with a sergeant who offered cards through a fence and said simply, "Come on then. Let's see if Germans know anything about American rummy." The cards are still there, in that museum, yellowed and worn. Sometimes visitors pause to look at them, puzzled by why such ordinary objects merit display. The explanatory placard tells a condensed version of the story, but words can only gesture toward the transformation those cards represented. They sit behind glass now, preserved and protected, no longer functional objects but historical artifacts. Yet their message endures, as relevant today as in 1943. That human connection transcends ideology. That treating others with dignity is not naivety but wisdom. That the small choices we make, the everyday decisions about how to treat the people we encounter, even people defined as enemies, these choices accumulate into history, into legacy, into the slow turning of the world toward justice or away from it. Klaus Hartmann learned that lesson in Mississippi pine forests, through card games with a sergeant from Tupelo. He carried it home to Germany. He built a life on it. And when the wall fell and Europe was whole again, free again, he understood that the victory belonged not just to politicians and generals, but to ordinary people like Roy Mitchell who had played cards with the enemy and in doing so had planted seeds of peace in the ruins of war. That is the story the cards tell. That is the truth they embody. That is why they matter, these 26 pieces of worn cardboard, relics of a conflict concluded 8 decades ago but whose lessons remain urgent, necessary, and profoundly hopeful in a world still struggling to choose humanity over hatred, connection over division. the open hand over the clenched fist.